Okay, it's 10:35. I think we should get started. You give me the green light? Yep. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm excited to be in Denver. This is my first time in Colorado. I was actually talking about going to Casa Bonita tonight. I don't know if anyone is a South Park fan here. I'm Gabriele Columbro. I'm the executive director of FINOS. We are the fintech open source foundation. And so I'm super excited to have a chance to talk with developers and hopefully by the end of the day, or at least my presentation, encourage you to contribute, not just to our foundation, but more so in fintech related open source. Actually, I had prepared another backdrop slide, which has both the good, the bad, and the ugly version of me. But to the people asking, Fintech Open Source Foundation is a nonprofit. We are part of the Linux Foundation. You guys are probably familiar with it. We are the financial services focused foundation in the Linux Foundation. I'm Italian, I guess, living in California, from that Italian part of California. Today, we're going to go through three main subjects. One, I'd like to share with you that open source has grown massively in the industry, even when it comes to banks. As you'll see, we work with some of the largest financial institutions in the world, and I think this presents a huge opportunity for fintechs. The bulk of the presentation is going to give you some highlights on what's good, what's bad, and what's really ugly in our journey and the experience that we've had in the hard job of creating an open source community in a regulated industry. And then how will it power a new fintech wave? How we think open source can really be a bridge between fintechs and financial institutions, which is something that I am actually riffing off something that was discussed here last year. Although I do think that most people still, when they think about open source in financial services, they sort of have this idea. I mean, this is an article from 10 years ago. And I'm not going to be telling you that it's all nice and great here. In fact, there's still bad and ugly parts to how this industry collaborates in open source. But I want to quote Angela Strange from last year. I wasn't here last year. I had a massive FOMO. And when she opened the conference by saying that, open source will power the next wave of financial services, a developer-centric, I think that was fundamental to point out that it's developers that are going to lead the next wave of innovation in this industry. And she went on to, talk about how we're moving from, a mainframe to, SaaS models to hopefully in the future a set of open source primitives, and even going as far as sort of explaining why, from standardization to having a global approach to just really reduction of costs. I mean, that was music to my ears. We started our journey 6 years ago in a not so swanky room in Wall Street, trying to create a foundation that would help this industry collaborate in open source, innovate through open source. Clearly a very diverse crowd 6 years ago, but hopefully you'll see we're doing better in that front as well. But one thing that I want to point out before we sort of dive into the crux of the presentation is that while I do believe that there is an aspect of personal choice and conscience to open source, that's sort of what brought me there 20 years ago. None of the most sort of the largest foundations, the large collaborative projects are, charity-based. Nobody does open source for charity. It is, it is admirable, but when you think about the largest foundations or the largest open source projects, there is an advantage for each of the different constituents. And so when we set up our foundation 6 years ago, the idea was really to deliver value to each of the constituents in the industry. And, hopefully today you learn how open source collaboration can be beneficial for you as fintech builders. So it's not about charity. It's not open source for open source sake. It's open source to drive innovation across the industry and hopefully deliver benefits to each of the constituents. I gotta say it worked out pretty nicely. There's still a lot more that we can do, but we are now seeing a massive acceleration of not only members, as a nonprofit, we are funded by our members. As you can see, there are some of the largest investment banks there. But also in terms of projects, ultimately as a nonprofit, we're not measured in revenue. We're measured in value that is delivered through our projects, solutions and business challenges that we solve through our projects. And we are now hosting almost 50 between open source projects, all Apache 2 licensed, open standards projects, and special interest groups, really to coalesce common interest in this industry. I'm always pretty proud of the slide, but again, this is just the funding side of it. Actually, the projects is where we think there is the most benefit. We even have a conference, a little bit of a shameless plug here, but if you are in the New York area, would love to see you in December. We have been running this conference now for 6 years, and again, 6 years ago, it was a big bet to think that we would have even anyone show up to an open source and financial services conference. The great news is now we see both developers, senior technologists, and executives joining us for something that I think it's really interesting and is really building up the community. The best communities are built over a beer. That's how I like to think about it, or a mocktail, whatever. There's a QR code there in case you want to apply for the call for papers. So let's go into the, in the sort of meat of the presentation. I would like to share with you what we have learned over the last 6 years in terms of, we'll start from banks first as to how they're engaging in open source, and we'll then turn to fintechs and what's the opportunity that I see here. So let's start with the good. I'm always an optimist. The first thing to call out is that differently from that article from 10 years ago, the industry is finally recognizing the strategic value of open source. Like we all, I come from the Apache Software Foundation. I grew up in the sort of early 2000s decade. And, as a developer, I know how much, more efficient, more just enjoyable the experience of building in the open is. But as you look at CTO in these banks, at sort of senior executives, a few years ago, I don't think they would have understood the power that open source has to drive innovation, to reduce costs, to bring talent in. This is something that we're going to touch multiple times during the presentation. Talent is probably one of the main drivers why banks are actually engaging in open source. And it's great that they are actually saying, something that makes sense. They will consider open source solutions ahead of proprietary solution where possible. It's not always possible. I'm not a fundamentalist. Not everything should be open source. There's a lot of things, more than what banks and some other people think, it can be open sourced. In case you're wondering, the data that we're going to look at today comes from a survey that we ran last year. It was the first State of Open Source in Financial Services survey. We're running a new one this year, so hopefully we can compare and contrast whether we made an impact and whether the movement is growing. The report is freely available. The data is freely available in case you want to slice it and dice it. You're more than welcome. And so as they understand the value, they are indeed improving their open source posture. What does that mean? Well, first of all, they are increasing consumption. Consumption of open source is ubiquitous. Even when I started 6 years ago, some of these executives will tell me, hey, no, we don't do open source. Yes, you do. Like, you just don't know, which is actually the worst nightmare for a risk and compliant person at a bank. You want to provide railroads that are not cumbersome for developers, but allow them, because we will find a way to get a library into our project, regardless of all the sort of roadblocks that you can put there. And so how they're structuring themselves, I would say two primary aspects. One, on the sort of policy and organizational structure side. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of OSPO, Open Source Program Office. It's a pretty common construct in small to large enterprises as to sort of a centralized authority in the company to manage inbound and outbound open source. I would think I've seen 10 OSPOs in these banks created in the last 6 to 9 months. It's accelerating. They're even being recognized. The OSPO of the Year is the Goldman Sachs one. That's an award from our sister foundation, the To Do Group, which enables, in the Linux Foundation, large companies to participate to open source efficiently. And secondly, from a cultural standpoint, culture has been a huge limiting factor for opening, not just consumption of open source, but especially contributing non-differentiating software. And so we are seeing these banks really hiring in the sense, hiring in that direction, bringing folks from the West Coast, bringing in folks from commercial open source companies like Red Hat. Now this is an example of Citi hiring a pretty senior open source person from Red Hat. So we are seeing all the right signals from the industry and from these banks that, not for charity, let's be clear, but they see immense value in starting to participate to open source. And that has led to some, pretty cool tech out there. These are just a sample of some projects that we have in FINOS, and by no means FINOS is the only thing that is going on in open source and fintech, but of course, I speak from my experience and sort of a good sample here. Each one of these projects has been contributed by a large investment bank. Perspective, it's a data visualization library. You guys should check it out, unless you use it already. It's 12,000 stars, I think, on GitHub, if I remember correctly. Open source by JP Morgan. Legend, open source by Goldman Sachs, a very mature data modeling platform. The goal is to standardize data models across the industry. It's just we like small challenges. Morphir was open sourced by Morgan Stanley. Waltz was open sourced by Deutsche Bank. And then there are collaborative efforts in terms of standards and in terms of implementing common regulation, which I think it's a theme that we're going to touch more throughout the presentation. Again, if you want to learn more, we have a landscape, which is a pretty common construct in the Linux Foundation. You're more than welcome to use any of these projects. And that has led, again, I would never think 5 years ago I would see this, but our top contributors, basically 7 of our 10 top contributors are from financial institutions. This is from last year. And I think that's even more powerful than all those nice logos that we saw in our membership. They're not just throwing money at it, they're actually spending and investing resources in maintaining projects in the open. I'm particularly proud of Legend. I mean, there's a big difference between throwing something there on GitHub and updating it once every 6 months. You do all your development internally and then you dump it every 6 months. All of these projects are open first in the sense that they deleted their internal branches. They are working in the open, deploying on Maven Central or on NPM and consuming from there, which basically locks them out, I guess, into the open. But it wasn't just a fluke. We are seeing the trend continuing. These are stats from this year, so it's not just one-off. The trend is accelerating. We are seeing more contributions. We're seeing more contributors. We're seeing more net new projects being contributed. Now, contributions is a great sort of leading indicator of strength of a community. But the actual value, as we were discussing before, gets delivered when people are using the software, are adopting the software. These are by no means perfect metrics. Downloads from central repositories are good sort of trend metrics, but of course, it can be your build system or your CI/CD pipeline that is downloading those packages. Maybe Goldman Sachs downloads one package and then 60,000 developers use it internally. So just take this with a grain of salt, but it's certainly encouraging to see that some of the projects that were contributed to us have seen such a outstanding growth in terms of downloads from the main repositories, either NPM or Maven Central. Actually, FDC3 is a standard that I would love for you guys to check out. It's an interoperability standard to build applications that can talk to each other, primarily for the financial desktop, but we have been, is more and more moving to sort of server side and truly sort of interoperable workflows. So not only we're seeing contribution to our foundation and more broadly to the ecosystem, but we're seeing upstream contributions. I'm sure you're familiar with upstream and downstream, but really is these industries realizing that they need to influence the core pieces of technology that are in the open. Think about Kubernetes, think about Node, think about Electron, think about the Linux kernel itself. Think about open source security. How many of you are familiar with the Log4Shell vulnerability from last year? Probably those who work in Java, mostly. But it was a massive catastrophe. In some of these large organizations, they're still figuring out 6 months later, 8 months later, where there are instances of Log4j. My huge fear was that they would pull back from open source and say, no, guys, see, we were right. Open source is evil. Open source is risky. Open source is going to get us in trouble. They actually have doubled down on investing on things like the Open Source Security Foundation, which is our sister foundation under the Linux Foundation, to the point that you have 4 major banks as platinum premier members of those foundations. Like you're talking, 200, 500K investments. In the realization that everyone has a part to play in not only securing the open source world, but also making it sustainable. Security is a function of the lack of maintainers most of the time. So the lack of attention from existing maintainers to security. I'm sure if you guys have seen that XKCD famous graphic of the random developer in Nebraska maintaining the whole infrastructure. Yeah, so that's what the Open Source Security Foundation. And there's plenty of examples like that. I mean, the 2 guys for Log4j, it was just 2 guys and doing it in their own time. So that's encouraging. And as I said, also when it comes to upstream projects, again, of course, I'm sharing primarily things that I learned from the Linux Foundation, but there's much more to that. But blockchain, cloud native, so Kubernetes, mission-driven foundations like OS Climate, Open Source Climate, and even more cool tech type foundations like GraphQL. So that's all good and great. And before I wrap on the good side, I want to talk quickly about standard bodies and industry consortia. This has been an industry that has had plenty of attempts at standardization. In some cases, it works. Fix, Swift, you can think about standards that did a major impact in the industry. But what many of the standards are missing, and where I think open source can really complement, is bringing the standards in the developer's hands in a as frictionless way as possible. I come more from the open source side, but I worked in open standards. They're 2 very different worlds, 2 very different type of people, 2 very different way of thinking. So the great news that we're seeing consortia like the International Swaps and Derivatives Associations, International Capital Markets Association, all of these sort of large established foundations or consortia looking at FINOS or open source as a way to accelerate the adoption of the standards, as a way to not only provide SDKs and bindings that hopefully you can just drop in your code through a dependency, but also to accelerate the process of feedback, pull requests, issues. And I think that's super important, not just for them, but it's super easy to break a standard. We'll talk about vendor lock-in in a few minutes. All it takes, especially in a highly interconnected industry like financial services, for one vendor in the chain to break the standard. And that sort of breaks the whole transaction, breaks the whole flow. So having a piece of open source code that does implement a standard that you can drop in and that everyone can base their implementation on drastically raises the chances that nobody breaks the standard. I want to close, in case you're wondering why. This is probably a whole other conversation, a whole other presentation. But what we've learned is that typically the engagement starts from the technology organization. Everyone is familiar with, we talked about talent. That's the main reason why those folks are engaging. They want to be more efficient. They want to not redevelop things that are non-differentiating and honestly, everyone has to comply with. Regulation is a huge example for me. A big part of what we do is called Open RegTech, is a major initiative for us to try and foster common regulatory technology. And of course, de-risk, reducing vendor lock-in. These are sort of probably the most applicable value proposition of open source for a technology company, for a technology-centric company. But what we're seeing is that many of these organizations are starting to engage in open source collaboration beyond code. It is driven by a better interaction with their counterparts, whether it is buy side, sell side. It is driven by a better interaction with regulators. We're trying to bring them into the fold to hopefully one day, before my kids grow up, writing open source machine readable regulation that can be directly implemented. Not this cumbersome hundreds of pages that then you have to rely on expensive lawyers or on a bank itself to fulfill. And of course, there are common challenges that these peers, they can collaborate on with their peers. What I am trying hard to push is the idea that open source can also be truly strategic, should be on the docket of the CIOs of this folks, should be a key technology pillar. As these companies want to become technology companies, as they're trying to promote, their APIs or their standards, and this is something that it's completely applicable to any of you. This is not just for financial institutions. I think this is exactly what I want to really hone in later on. Open source gives a vital chance to standards to thrive, if you do it right, if the project picks up. I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but in a very crowded market, it does give you a different approach. So I think the bottom line here, the growth in contributions is not just due to developers, which of course make up the vast majority of our contributors, but we invited business modelers, data analysts, machine learning, data scientists. This is a community that I think is going to become very exciting and very diverse, also from the standpoint of the personas that compose it. Good. We've done the happy part. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Let's go to the bad one. I'm going long, so I better accelerate a little bit. Clearly, there's still more work to do. Still very few organizations encourage upstream contribution. Still, many organizations heavily prohibit anything to do with open source. I do believe this is going to change in the next 2 years. And only a third has structured their company for participation to open source. Yeah, and then the Google Docs issue. I don't know if you guys have ever tried to collaborate with a bank on a sort of modern, interactive collaboration tool like, Google Docs or whatever collaborate tool of your choice. forget about it. Let's go back to, that's the one thing. While we won the GitHub battle, 6 years ago when we started, some of these banks couldn't even just see GitHub. Some of them could do a get, but not a post. Seriously, that was the firewall configuration. We haven't won the Google one, so let's get back to send documents back and forth. I worked many years in content management, so that kills me. And if you want to help us measure the change year over year, I would really appreciate if you can take the survey that we're running this year, the State of Open Source in Financial Services 2022. Again, shameless plug. You got the QR code there. I'll have this QR code later in the deck as well. Now, we talked a lot about banks. Let's hone in on the main audience here, the fintechs. There's clearly a lot of hype around this idea of open source in financial services and what can it bring to the industry. This article here is again from Angela. It was published by Andreessen Horowitz about a month after the FinTech DevCon, where she shared sort of that really, amazing vision that I subscribe to. That said, we're not seeing a lot of fintechs jumping on the bandwagon. And by coming to the party, I mean, of course you guys use a lot of open source. Of course, I'm sure you maintain libraries in the open. What I'm not seeing is necessarily the commercial, leveraging a commercial open source or a commercial open source go-to-market, business model or go-to-market, which I think it's actually particularly interesting in this tough economic climate. And we'll get back to it. So what do I mean by that? I mean, taking an open source project, think about Kubernetes, think about Hadoop, I'm aging myself, but turn it into a product, whether it be SaaS or whether it be like older style, packaging it and doing an enterprise version or an integration. And two things come out of that. Profit. We've seen massive exits in the last 3 years. Not only the Red Hats or the GitHub, but Databricks hasn't exited yet, but Confluent. Again, probably this would have been more compelling before the market died in the last 8 months. But the thing that drives is not only profit, it's contribution back. Like, part of those profits are generally contributed back in the sense of you are depending on an open source project, you want to have maintainers, you want to be able to lead where that project goes. We're not seeing a lot of that. I think that's my main call to action here, really. Don't get me wrong, there are examples. I'm an advisor for a company called OpenBB. They're trying to do an open source Bloomberg terminal. It went viral. Of course, we got Moov. That's why I'm here. So I'm a huge fan of what they're doing. And we have, other efforts in the open banking side of the house, and the financial inclusion and core banking. So don't get me wrong, there are examples. But when I look at, something like that, well, I don't see, again, a lot of examples of companies that are literally, again, I'm not saying using open source. Great, everyone does. It's making open source sort of the center of your go-to-market strategy, having an open source business model. I think there's a lot of potential here, and I would hope that more folks consider leveraging this model. Now let's go to the ugly. I will make sure to be on time here. Unsurprisingly, vendor lock-in. This is an industry that is still highly locked in by their vendors. And it's not just your typical, software vendor lock-in, end user application lock-in. You have data and data formats lock-in. There's still companies that think that keeping their data format proprietary is going to be the commercial differentiator. Again, I don't agree with that. I think open standardization, especially in the era of platforms, in an industry that is so connected, is going to grow the pie much more than you trying to fight for a very small slice by locking in customers. But that creates a lot of fragmentation. Identity lock-in, that's another big one. There are realms of regulated identity providers that really have no interest to interoperate with others. And therefore, you create this little, think about the Venn diagram with very little overlap. And then finally, regulated entity lock-in. This is what I was mentioning before. Many of the fintechs find themselves to have to partner with a bank because of the regulated nature. And I do believe that if more open source primitives were to come available to solve common regulatory concerns, and that's what we're really trying to have this bank do, open source some of their regulatory technology, well, that would reduce reliance from the fintechs to the incumbents. I find that to be a major sort of business risk in the business model of fintechs. This is one that I'm particularly fond about it. Open banking has driven a major, I think, evolution in the system, in the financial system. But this is still an industry that, especially from a perception standpoint, is still quite immature to be able to distinguish what's truly open and truly open source from what's, what we call open washing. Whether it is, everyone loves to associate themselves with the word open. So I'm not going to go into more details, but, beware. When you see open, if you don't see the GitHub repository link anywhere in the first page, that's a good sign that probably there's not a lot of open there. And again, not everything should be open source. Open API is valid. Open standards are great. But just what does open really mean here? I think we're still seeing a lot of those people that just use open for marketing purposes, not really to build a de facto standard. And then last but not least, I have a bit of a grievance with the constant fights in this industry, whether it is regulation versus deregulation, whether it is legacy versus blockchain, whether it is banks versus fintechs, or whether each coin has to have its own foundation. Like, of course, I'm biased because we have a foundation, but I think in some cases this is also fueled by the press. The press loves, to create fights. And call me an optimist, but I'm seeing open source as a chance to actually build bridges rather than continuing to fragment. Because otherwise the risk, in my opinion, is that we'll go from what clearly is a mess as far as the incumbents go. I mean, when I took this job 6 years ago, I was like, yeah, high frequency trading, I'm gonna work with lots of cool technologists. And then they explained me what happened in the back end, like for a trade to actually close. Whew. I was like, what did I get myself into? But the risk is that we will go from a centralized mess to a completely decentralized mess, where we need to have point-to-point connections across all these amazing sort of fintech applications and solutions that are being built. So how do we get there? And by that I mean, as Angela was suggesting last year, to a place where we have common open source primitives that can be leveraged both by fintechs, finserves, and technology vendor alike. Well, I think it's important to lead with value. We think there is value for each of these participants. We talked a lot about the value for financial institutions. We'll talk the value about fintechs. We are bringing in the regulators. We're starting to see the buy side, the side that everyone wants to please, joining up and joining the foundation and starting to really think how they can influence technology through open source. And of course, we have several technology companies. Again, I cannot go time-wise into the details of each constituents and what are sort of the value proposition that we're seeing. But based on this inclusive and sort of global approach, that's our proposal to get there. One, a global approach. Yes, we should be mindful that especially when it comes to regulation, there's very different requirements, and so you don't want to boil the ocean, but you want to be creating, I think open source has the potential to start local to then evolve into a global standard. And organizations like us, have the possibility of, to help you get into standard bodies like ISO or IETF to really up-level the visibility and the maturity of your project. Fintech engagement, that's my first and foremost goal for being here, candidly. We would like to see more fintechs not only contributing, but making money out of our projects. That is how you fuel the growth of a community. And how? Well, developer first. That's what we think open source enables. As we said before, standards are great, but open source allows it to get it in your hands quickly. 5 lines of a dependency in a build file, or maybe 1, depending on what build system you use. I think it's super important to understand that if there's no trust, we wouldn't have been able to do this if we didn't have if we weren't religious about maintaining a transparent governance and a meritocratic governance that is independent from the money that these banks or these institutions pay to us. The corporate governance is completely separated from the community governance. You don't need to pay to participate. The membership tier that you are in has no bearing on whether you are a maintainer, a lead maintainer, that it's fully meritocratic, like it should be. And so hopefully makes it welcoming for fintechs as well. It allows to build bridges and hopefully have an incremental replacement. Going back to that idea of constant fights, I hope that there's a third way. You don't have to be always A or B. I think open source can little by little displace from the bottoms up a very, very siloed infrastructure that exists in banks and across the workflow. And then ultimately, we think that this will drive what I call Darwinistic consolidation, like may the best open source project win. In a way, we see ourselves a little bit like a VC of open source projects, meaning we're not going to give you money, but we do nurture multiple projects that sometimes do similar things. And we let the community, ultimately it's going to be the adopters, the builders, to decide which is the winning technology. This is not about, backhand deals in some room in Wall Street or in Canary Wharf. So, in closing, why should you care? And I realize here that many of you are both founders and developers, but for the sake of argument, allow me to split those two personas. We touched on it, I think, especially in this economic climate, open source gives you a vital chance of really disrupting the market in a market that is indeed very crowded. The analogy that I always have is that open source allows you to expand the pie rather than fighting to expand your small slice of this pie. Again, very complex and very crowded market. And when I say in this economic climate, I mean it's getting harder and harder to get that massive Series A or the massive even seed funding. Open source go-to-market is much cheaper. Again, it's not always successful. I'm not promising here the moon, but it does start by definition much cheaper because you start developer first, you put your project open source, sort of self-adoption, and hopefully, with the right things and hopefully with the right help, go big. You get the chance to reuse bank-originated production-grade code. Let's be honest, no, not all code is amazing coming from banks. Just don't get me wrong. And a lot of it's actually not even differentiating. But we have a strong technical steering committee that is helping to select what actually is something that is generally useful for the industry. And that to me is specifically important or particularly important in the regulatory world. As I said, many of you have to rely on banks or at least integrate or partner with banks, because of regulatory requirements, because not only the years and years of technology, but the army of lawyers that I have deployed over the years in interpreting, building those relationships in Washington or elsewhere. I do think that with your help, we can actually get open source primitives out there, and we can bring also the regulators in the fold to hopefully, again, I'm not saying bless, because the guys are not very forthcoming in blessing public technologies, but to at least adopt some of these standards and some of this technology. Now, if you're a developer, well, look, first of all, as much as when I joined this industry, I found that financial service developers in banks are more motivated by extrinsic motivators, aka they have big fat paychecks. They still want to collaborate on problems that are larger than themselves, problems that they don't want to reinvent and resolve over and over and over again in the next startup or the next bank. So I think that's one important aspect for developers to engage. It allows you to focus on creative work, while hopefully the plumbing and the non-differentiating work is collaborated upon. It's mutualized. Maybe someone else is maintaining it. And then, finally, there's the talent aspect. Whether you're looking for a job or not in a bank, being a leader in this movement that it's still, honestly, it is in its nascent phase, will certainly do good for your career, I think. So what's our goal? As I said, FINOS is not the only place where open source is happening. There is amazing open source out there. I think this list from Moov it's great. On the other hand, it's a little bit unstructured. No, I mean, I don't know what's an open source repository, but and there are. If you go on GitHub and on the finance stack, there are 4,500 projects out there. How do you even begin to pick? And so our hope, again, borrowing again from Angela's presentation last year, is that we can move from that unstructured, amazing, but organic set of open source projects to a more, consolidated set of winners, quote unquote. And again, I'm not necessarily saying that these are the winners. I'm just putting there some examples of projects that exist and they're open source in those different layers. But wouldn't it be nice to, having the core that is really non-differentiating being more and more based on open source primitives. And of course, we'd love to help you get there. What we do is really taking projects and partnering with the maintainers to help build community, maintaining the infrastructure, get visibility in an industry that is very crowded. As I said, it's free. If you want to learn how to contribute, go to community.finos.org or just straight up to our GitHub org. And even if you cannot contribute or you don't want to contribute, we'd love your feedback. The last keynote speaker said something very powerful, which I agree with. You have a huge power in your hands. The industry is realizing that developers are the ones who actually are going to make this happen. And the more we go on with the generations, the more developers there's going to be. The trend is not going in the other direction. So even if you're not convinced, you don't feel like you could to contribute, give us your feedback. Let us know what we can do better to include fintechs more in this, what I think is an exciting potential for collaboration. And with that, I think we might be 4 minutes late, so I don't know that I have time for questions. Maybe one?
How many of these open source projects are created from scratch versus like it's existing code that's in the bank that they're making open source? How does
So I would say in terms of split, probably, I wouldn't say 50-50, maybe it's 60-40, roughly. Like 60% are coming from existing projects that are open sourced. 40% actually start from scratch, in the sense that we do have this concept of special interest groups that are more like talking groups rather than projects, and really coalesce interest, say, around the one around regulation innovation, one around DevOps mutualization, one around, what am I missing? Anyway, it's interest-centric and allows to coalesce interest, and then they say, okay, yeah, we have the same priority, the same challenges, let's start an open source project collaboratively from scratch. How it happens, the one thing, a member will propose a contribution. We have a whole, very structured template that you can find on GitHub. It's all in the public. And we actually just created a technical steering committee that now reviews inbound net new projects for really usefulness, potential for the community, and even really political dynamics, really. Like, is it a single bank type project? Is it going to have more than one company maintaining it or adopting it, or at least do the initial maintainers commit to it? So it's a pretty thorough review process, but I have to say we are still trying to build the mass, so the bar is not incredibly high. Any more? Yeah? I hope it's a good answer. Any more questions? I know we're out of time. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors. And these are 3 QR codes for your perusal. I'm going to leave them here. I hope to see you in our community, and I hope to see you in New York if you're there in December. Thank you so much.